Okay, a very good evening to you all, and thanks for coming here today. It is a great pleasure, actually, to have with us today Alexander de Groot and Luk Peeters, partners of the Organization of Permanent Modernity, an architectural and urban design firm based on 2 locations, comprising an academic group at MIT Boston, and a professional practice station in both Boston and Brussels. Alexander is an associate professor at MIT, and he completed his PhD at the Berlage Institute in 2007, and before that, Masters in Urban Design in Harvard GSD. And Luk obtained his Masters in Civil Engineering and Architecture and a Master's degree in Urbanism at University of Leuven in Ghent. And before setting up the Organization of Permanent Modernity with Alexander, Luk also worked at Rahul Bunchkoten's Cora in London. So central to the work of Alexander and Luk is the interest in the formalization and objectification of infrastructural element. They share with us today their practices, work, and research that focuses on architectural interventions on infrastructure. This work, as I understand it, relies fundamentally on the reactivation and revalidation of late-modernist templates, which includes, among others, the open platform building, the megastructure, and the monument grouping. And what I find most interesting, of course, is their position is one that accepts and insists upon the static, definitiveness, and permanent nature of architecture. And it is through these qualities that they insist that architecture offers its best answers to the problem of urbanization and of the city. Therefore, it is also not a surprise that their point of reference and departure is in the 50s and 60s, in particular the work of Louis Serd, Fumiko Maki, and Louis Kahn, and to appropriate from them ideas of the core, master form, and symbolic form, respectively. This reactivation, according to Alexander and Luk, is necessary as it confronts the problem of estrangement caused by the grey goo, as he would term it, the suburban sprawl afloat in a sea of asphalt. This reactivation is also timely in light of the irrational exuberance of iconic buildings of recent past. And it is also vital as this reactivation reconsiders infrastructure, not as mobility system, but as artifacts, a work of art in its own right. So please join me in welcoming Alexander de Groot and Luk Peeters.
Good evening. Thank you very much for allowing us the honor to be here in this great institution to speak to you this evening about our passions, and I hope that in what we will present tonight we can get you to either be inspired or else disagree with, with some of the things that we would like to push in architecture today. The title for tonight's presentation is Suburban Formology. Second title is Towards the Objectification of Infrastructure. And I'd like to say right off the bat that what I would like to discuss with you, what we would like to discuss with you mostly tonight, is this particular topic, the objectification of infrastructure as potentially architecture's primary task when it comes to providing a form of civic order to the ever more vastly expanding realm of our suburbs. And please don't kind of pigeonhole us right away as Americans in saying this when we talk about suburbs. The suburban realm, the non-compact historic city, that vast field of half-urbanized stuff, is not a principally American phenomenon. It's at least as present in Western European agglomerations, not to mention the vast urbanizations tracts that are currently visible in Southeast Asia and in Southern Asia in general. So we'd like to discuss this as a central problem that the field of engagement, the biggest crisis for architecture, or the biggest raison d'etre for architecture, the biggest reason for us to still be engaged in innovation, is not the projects that happen in downtowns where you can make it with nice icons or nice signature buildings, and you can get a career in that, and that's all good and fine. I have no criticism of that. It's just that we know how to do that. We also know how to build a nice historic-looking city. I mean, I don't mean that as nice as in something that I actually like, but nevertheless, the idea of building a compact historic city is something for which we have, over the last 30, 40 years, acquired the knowledge and the skills about how to do that. So neither the signature building nor the good city fabric present critical challenges for our generation. Again, we know how to do that. Now, what we don't know is how we need to deal with that monstrosity that is our endlessly expanding suburban realm. This thing, this field, sheer endless and expanding, is held together by a near infinite web and overlayer of infrastructures and more infrastructures that seem to be the only thing that have some kind of regional significance. However, these infrastructures have been, so far, predominantly the domain of technocracy, engineering, urban planning, regional planning, policy planning, codification, bureaucracy, never or rarely of architecture. And this is, and now I get particular about the American context, something that I think is critical for us to change. Let me take a step back and try to contextualize this project a little bit in our own work. Thank you for the nice introduction, Chris. And as you said, we have the firm, the organization, which basically conducts competitions, builds professional work, or tries to engage with large-scale professional work for clients. And we have the research group as well, which deals with these things on a more theoretical and hypothetical, speculative basis. So we publish papers, publish books. We also make master plans, sometimes win competitions, and have now our first 4 really sizable buildings under construction, and we will show these tonight. Moreover, we've tried to group our work in general hypotheses. A hypothesis that has organized our thinking over the last 6 or 7 years until about a year and a half ago is the one that you see here. That's called The Liberal Monument, a book that for those of you that don't know, that came out with Princeton Press about a year ago, in 2010. And that is a summary of a dissertation that aims to propose a certain idealism about a template for public form, for collective form, that is highly political and ideological in nature, and that nevertheless posits an ideal about an alternative to that vast suburban realm that I just came to describe to you. And as of yet, I would say unrealized alternative. Now, this overall hypothesis, this proposal, the liberal monument, this template, this ideogram, we've studied it, we've researched it historically, and the way we've gone about this from a method point of view is that we've basically went through a historical moment, let's say 1943 about until 1960 something. In this period, we were able to detect the contours of a project that never really came to full fruition, but that nevertheless was argued for by a series of distinct authors that had overlapping voices, together constructing a family of resemblances between positions, leading to a kind of a project even though it wasn't built. Okay, we believe in this project, we still do, and we'd like to push this, but from a sort of theoretical point of view, currently also we believe this has been exhausted, at least for us. So we push it, but the further theoretical investigations are now in a different umbrella. And this is what I'd like to actually focus our conversation tonight about. The objectification of infrastructure is a second big hypothesis, another 6 or 7 year research span, which we started about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, and which we hope to bring into fruition with another book 3, 4 years down the road, a book like this one. The objectification of infrastructure, and now I'll get a little more particular, is an attempt to look at and deal with infrastructure in a way completely different from the way we've accustomed to think it. I mean, we think, and I mean with we, I also mean unfortunately architects, think of infrastructures as systems. We indulge systems theory. We like the vast scale. We are enamored by it, and so we think about systems and networks and connectivity and transportation, and those are the terms with which we conceptualize that big suburban landscape. And surprisingly, the resulting landscape is huge, extremely connected, and the discrete figures that once constituted city and against its background landscape or hinterland disappear, and what you get is an ever vastly glued together field of half-urbanized stuff, a field, one could argue, in which there is no horizon, a field from which there is, in other words, no escape. So this large suburban vast field without clear anchor points, with an endless connectivity, an endless system of exchange, facilitated by technocratic means, is a system without a horizon. It is, in a sense, our collective prison, a space from which there is no escape, a space from which we seem to be unable to construct an alternative. This, I think, is the principal change that has occurred over the last 20, 30 years. This is the background of all our operations, yours and ours. The attempt is, can we start to deal with this in a more conscious way? The one thing that is still collective or public, very thinly so, but yet it's there, are those regional infrastructures, the interstates, the railroads, that stuff, those lines that crisscross, but that we again only think about as networks and systems. I think that's the primary error. So the argument we make with you tonight is that we need to find a way to discuss infrastructure from an architectural point of view, with an architectural language, and taking cues from the architectural traditions. In other words, not these kinds of models, which once more reduce the field of objects and the sea of suburbanization to networks, systems, invisible connections. But definitely also not the work of our friends of Archigram, which reduces that residual collectivity or publicness that is still in our infrastructures, in our suburban infrastructures, reduces it further and really squeezes it until all that's left is linear, fluids of speed. But instead, project like this. This is Archigram's interchange, and this is an interchange, also traffic interchange, designed by Hans Hollein in 1962. Now, this, I would argue with you, is an example of an objectified infrastructure. An infrastructure that does not search to reinforce its own systematicness, its own continuity, but rather the fact that there are discontinuities, objecthoods, moments when the system comes to a standstill, and it's actually possible to clot something, to produce a form, an object, a space. This was simply a theoretical investigation exhibited at the Richard Feigen Gallery in 1968, the project from 1962. It was exhibited in Chicago. Okay. Now, Hollein was definitely not the only one trying to deal with the slowing down or with the objectification of infrastructure. In the realm of art, there have been, especially also recently, a series of interesting investigations. This is Panamarenko with a design of a race car in concrete, one that obviously does not move. And this, most of you probably know, this is Jean Tinguely with the artwork, I think it's called Rhinoceros. A montage of dysfunctional, technocratic, leftover fossils and objects into a new kind of formation. Okay, so that's in art, and that's all good and well. We all love art. So what about architecture? So for now, we've identified 3 streams, let's say, endogenous to the architectural tradition, that are dealing with objectification of infrastructure. All 3 of them arrive, let's say, for the first time in late modernism, again at that moment in the 50s and the 60s. And so in a sense, the method with which we've been working is similar to that of the liberal monument. That is to say, we take a historical moment, a moment of genesis, and try to understand what that means and how, if there's anything left there that's interesting that deserves to be reactivated. So the 3 streams, or lineages, or weaves, whatever you want to call them, that we'd like to discuss with you tonight are 1, open platforms / open platforms is the optimistic term, the term with integrity. The vulgar counter term is big boxes. So this is a painting by Ed Ruscha of big boxes, so it's already both terms at once. It's one lineage. The second lineage is that of, the structural infill paradigm, one articulated by Hertzberger and Habraken in the Low Countries and Kroll, and then of course by Erskine and Sterling also in the UK context, as well as by several Scandinavian architects. We will discuss this with you as well. And then thirdly, of course, an old classic for every junior architect, the megastructure, but not as a fad, but really as something that has an internal logic that can be somehow put apart and back together in a reasonable way. So 3 models, or I should say templates, not models, templates, about the objectification of infrastructure, an objectified way of thinking about infrastructure that come from our own architectural endogenous tradition, that were from that historical moment, for some reason that either have been forgotten, haven't been discarded. And I think it behooves us to, if not reactivate them, at least look at them and see how we can use them in an attempt to take control and responsibility in civic and public terms of our own realm, of that vast suburban terrain. So what we'll do with you is, for each of these 3 streams, present to you on the one hand a little bit of the historical, theoretical background, or at least some precedents, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a project that we are doing currently that is being built, that is being realized, that serves as for us as a concrete investigation about how we can attempt to make this work today. So our projects, our building projects, are in this sense really experiments. We don't expect them to be pretty or to be beautiful or to be finite, beautiful museum objects. They are attempts to revive a lineage, and it can fail, and that's okay. But we know what we're doing. We're not, we try to give a meaning to our work by trying to, for each of these lineages, creating ancestry in architecture. All right, so we will start with the big box. The way we will do this conversation is we will exchange positions several times, Luke and myself, as what we do also in the office is have a systematic conversation that goes from, code and codification and the technocracy of building on the one hand, all the way to theory and philosophy, and we expose those to each other all the time. And in that sense, we're conceptually doomed to both write in a hopefully scholarly and serious way, as well as to build substantial scale projects. And this is what we try to balance. And that's also the essence of our partnership. Okay, that big box, or the open platform. First of all, I'd like to contend with you that, the big box today, this is just some generic image from some generic American city, is without any doubt the victor, the survivor, in a Darwinian struggle of survival between different types and typologies in the post-war American suburban world. In other words, we've had an enormous expansion of the built realm in the post-war US world, East Coast cities as well as West Coast. And besides the cottage industry of residential houses, if you look at all the other types of building, various types have been tried out. This one emerges victoriously. It gets built over and over again ad nauseum as a sort of, we can be very nasty about it. You could call it some kind of cancer in the landscape. Well, that doesn't change it. It's there, and it's growing, and it's being built every day over and over and over again. In fact, there is something about this type where you can argue this is really not a building anymore. It's scarcely architecture. It's a piece of prepackaged engineering, a product that gets assembled on the ground, and that has an enormous scale, a scale beyond the conventional building object. In fact, a scale commensurate to the scale of the suburban realm. You get buildings here that are easily 1.5 kilometers, a mile, in other words, sometimes even longer, and all that is no problem. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just stating the facts. Now, these kinds of buildings have, we can call them vulgar projects, we can call them market capitalism, we can call them exchange, buildings that are based on the principle of exchange, and all that is true. But you know what? There is also a sort of hidden generosity in these buildings. It's cheaper for a type like this to overbuild by 10,000 square feet or 1,000 square meters. And using the same repetitive modules. And in other words, to create excess interiors, excess building, excess interior open space. It's cheaper to do that than it is to tailor a building to a particular footprint that is required by the program. In other words, rather than customizing a building, it's better to standardize and overbuild. That's a kind of generosity. It also flies in the face of all the attempts that we also really flirt with sometimes at mass customization and the increasing geometrical complexity that the digital realm allows us. And we love that too, don't get us wrong, but at the same time, there's something going on here that deserves and needs our attention. So that's when you get to that generosity. You have excess interior space, you can basically organize an entire realm, entire living sphere on the inside. Now, that's the big box, that's the vulgarity yielding, in a sense, potential, but in any case, some kind of order, big territorial walls, long structures crisscrossing the landscape that are there. and that we can use, abuse, appropriate, and maybe we can change things with that type. In any case, again, it is there. Now, is it only something that vulgar value engineering efforts have produced, or is there an internal tradition about architecture that has once identified the potentials of this type? And the answer is yes. This is from Cedric Price, the Potteries Think Belt project. The Potteries Think Belt is a project for a university campus in northern England in the 70s, miserable area, lots of unemployment, we in dire need for an ideal, for an escape, for another mode. So Price identified 3 locations and built the university campus on 3 distinct locations, and then had the students take trains and basically navigate between these 3 through the course of their curriculum. So circulation, of course, infrastructure is important, but at this point, what I want to talk about is the terminal station. Each of these 3 terminals are big boxes. The big box is not argued for from the viewpoint of market value engineering and all that stuff, argued for from the viewpoint of internal flexibility and, in fact, the liberation of man. And what I mean by that is like there is a sort of a utopian drive in projects like this, also in projects like, let's say, Yona Friedman's open platforms, but also in these platform buildings, where the complete openness of the interior, the complete lack of structure provided by the internal, provided by the logic of this kind of building, allows you to appropriate to make it yours, to build your own universe within this. In other words, it's an architecture built for a freed human being, an architecture that is not in prison, but that frees up. That's the idea. So there is a tradition internal to architecture that wanted to use large, open, empty frames, not as a means for capitalist exchange, but as a means for internal liberation of the users. This is a second project, or a second station. This is a third one. It's not important for us to go into details, but I mean, look at that. And that's not a pyramid, that's basically a pile of earth from the coal mines that you see dug up in the back. So what you see here is that instead of, you see a radical flattening, a horizontalization, sort of eradication of three-dimensional expression, a sort of building becoming really vast and really almost commensurate with the scale of the suburban territory and its means of production itself. So rather than that kind of this style type exercise of a Schroeder-like house, we actually evolve again to the flat plane like painting, where the third dimension is simply abolished and all that's left is a 2D or at best a 2.5D. So, having said that, having identified 2 traditions about big box thinking, one which is idealistic and inspired by, one which is endogenous to architecture, the open platform ideal, the other one being the vulgar market ideal, we said, okay, let's see if we can build a box today in a suburban context and define with that a series of potentially interesting architectural encounters. And so we are now going to show you one of the projects near Brussels.
So this is the project we call ASCO. It's a town nearby Brussels, Assem, and it lays on a main road. It's a medieval road that relies Brussels to the coast. In fact, it's an historical road, and it goes through the town center. And what is typical about those roads, that is that they already now they have a lot of sprawl buildings and sprawl objects along those main roads outside of the town centers themselves. In the master plan of the town, there was, and this is already built, is the start of a ring road going around the town center to make the town a little bit more livable. And the idea was, okay, let's make a clear definition between the hardscape of the town center and the landscape. The landscape, you need to imagine it's like agriculture, cultivated landscape. On the right hand, the green area. The site itself, it was a former factory of asphalt. It was sort of like a brownfield, and there was a serious rehabilitation program by which the the town became owner of the site. And yeah, it was convenient for them they had to relocate some medium scale program to outside of the center, and so it was the program was they want a new youth center, a new fire station, a new police station, and they said, okay, we're gonna put that exactly on that spot because it was owned by the town. The definition they gave that by themselves was in fact, okay, we need a building for the youth center, we need a building for the fire station, we need a building for that, and so on. So the risk was, and that is what you see here, that is that we would create another sprawl into the landscape, and that's exactly what we think that should be avoided. So here was in fact the program that was asked by the town. And ORG suggested to combine all these programs, all these buildings, and to generate one generous building. It is like a linear building that is continuous going into the landscape. It is a very huge building, and yeah, the type that we found it appropriate to design with is of course the big box type to create this long structure. As you can see, the parcels, we redefined it along this built form. By making this form, this linear form, we introduced a new term, let's say. We call that the land form, as it is a form that overlays the landscape and could react on the scale of the landscape by itself. That also keeps view to the landscape possible. It is really like a suburban building into the landscape. Here you see the form by itself. In fact, we as ORG we were the urbanistic designer of the whole form, but it was in combination with another architectural form that designed the youth center, which is situated here near to this ring road, and the police station, which will be built afterwards at the end there. And ORG was also the architect of the fire station, which is situated there. What was also a very strategic thing that we wanted to maintain, that is that, okay, in this situation where you have a very thinned out urbanity, let's say, we try to catch everything that is possible to create some kind of urbanity on a very specific spot on the project. And this is in fact what we call then the public room, where we try to combine all the circulation that needs to go through the site. There will be a lot of sport fields also there, and there will be some commuter parking that will be situated on the other side. So there will be a lot of traffic, both motorized and slow traffic. But also the entrances, the front door of all the building is situated to this public room. Here you can see what will be the urban, the form, the land form, and what is typical. So we retold a little bit the big box elements. I will show it also later. But in fact, what to us the big box elements are the skeleton, like the columns, the beams. And of course, the facade, the envelope that needs to be designed. Very specifically here, the buildings themselves, they are like the structure, the beams and the columns, but the facade becomes an urbanistic element. It goes beyond the architectural element of the function itself. So the envelope becomes an urbanistic element. But it's also very important. That is the continuity of the landscape itself. As you can see, it is here shown with the yellow parts. So we divide the buildings by public space just in between the program building itself. Here was the first maquette. That was the first idea of the landform itself. As you can see, the landform could be endless. It can go endlessly into the landscape, and it creates a new linear town development of public program. What is also important, as you can see here, that is a continuity through the landform. Here on the left side, you can see the gates of the fire station. It is like the big gates that where all the fire trucks are situated. And here you can see the openness towards this public room, which has a continuity of the landscape, but on the inside of the landform, we create a separate universe. The public landscape becomes really a public room and a space of civic activity. Here you can see it also, this continuity through the landform itself. So I already said it. This is the rethinking of some big box elements, skeleton, industrial beams. We put them together. We separate them also. We give them a separate identity and formal consciousness as separate elements. We also rotate them in a way. We put them a little bit further out of together so that we can add other program and that we can add daylight and so on into these boxes. Here you can see that the maquette of the fire station part. For example, what we tried also to do, this is a very industrial beam. This is a beam that is common used in big boxes, in a wooden beam. And in fact, you can do a lot of things with it to give some particularity in the architecture. You can flip them over, you can rotate them, you can slide them a little bit open so that they can adapt themselves to the context of the function that is inside of it. But it stays the formal element that was designed of the original big box. Openness of the structure is very important. And here you can see a montage. It's of the rendering of this public room with the continuity and of the landscape. Okay, thanks.
All right. So we go into the second lineage, the second line, universal building, Habrack and Hertzberger, the structural infill paradigm. This is a site in Brussels, but it's not, although the skyline would suggest that this is central in the middle of the city, it's really not. It's at a sort of a cusp moment where on the one hand, there's still 19th century city and compactness, but to the bottom right of our drawing, you get increasingly into a sort of suburban area, just sheds, empty spaces, parking lots, that shitty area that we call, our topic of study. This area is this is a big market hall, a 100 by 100 meter roof structure, very spectacular. It is currently has slaughterhouses, huge market spaces, and big parking lots. So it's a very open, empty, but quite programmed area. That's the historical form of it, when it was still outside the city and the city grew around it. And we've worked now for about 2 to 3 years with this client to develop a strategy to rethink this site. And from our own point of view, this investigation is based on the universal building, on the open building structure by Habraken, but with an important twist, a change to the historical plot. Here you see again the site, the market building, and that whole emptiness, but emptiness that is vivaciously planned in with lots of markets, etc. Those kinds of, that's a kind of experiential vibe here. That's the basement level. All right. So, and as you can see, this area is frankly, within the greater figure of Brussels, is really a figure of regional importance. If this is Brussels, here you have the European district, here you have the big church, and here you have the area of the tour and taxis, which is currently being redeveloped as one of the major office and park and residential sites. This site really then is on that big circular subway that defines the downtown, but while it has a functional charge, it doesn't have a form yet. It has a huge informal community, big informal economy, but no form. And that's been our task, is basically to give it a form. In order to help you understand this plan, this is the drawing of the roof of the big market structure. And what you see here is basically almost six identical buildings. And that's the basic proposal of the mass plan, is 6 identical big buildings, about 7 by 100 meters, some are even bigger, that simply sit around an emptiness, and by sitting there in the right way, define that emptiness, and that's all they ever do. So what they do, by defining that space, is giving form to the informal, that huge informal community of immigrants and relatively not so well-off people that populate this part of Brussels, all of a sudden get a form. They get a mirror to themselves, they get confronted with their own space and their own form and their own role in the bigger regional community of Brussels today. Now, I want to talk about this, the identity of these buildings, or the lack of identity, more precisely. So here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Identical. This first one, which is the most complicated one, because it relates most closely to fabric with different geometries and complexities, is the building permanent. So we hope to start construction of this very soon. Here's the big Open Plaza. And the idea of this project is that every of these buildings is in fact flexibly programmable. It's a bit like a big box, except it's urban. So it's like a warehouse, an entrepot. It has between 3 and 8 stories. And it can be filled flexibly between either parking, markets, residential. We actually propose that one of them has a sort of compact urban version of a slaughterhouse. And that way we propose an urbanization scheme that actually leaves all things possible. So we plan with form, not with program. And here you see again from a more close-up, also this historical building just needs to be renovated and it will be operational again. So a project that takes a typology that is even from the viewpoint of dominant type along the canal, because by the way, I didn't mention this, but the canal of Brussels, an industrial lifeline, has spawned many kind of 19th century entrepôts and warehouses along its edge. Well, I mean, this is a sort of a version on steroids of that type, building an entire neighborhood with that typological principle in order to yield a consistent neighborhood. We've been inspired, of course, again also with the way in which the heights sometimes operate by Louis Kahn and the series of citadels that he proposed for Philadelphia. Simply building a sort of a series of forts around an empty space as being enough to define where the center is. Yes, well, the idea that parking structures can be multifunctional, multi-programmable has now been proven. So this was very helpful to make our case to the client. And of course, there's a longer tradition of buildings without iconic identity. Simply the value neutral, the formally neutral warehouse that has a very clear, I mean, this is not a facade that's undetermined. It's a very clear and rigorous facade, but it makes no identity statement. This is also what we're proposing. I mean, this in a sense is an attempt, and now I get into one particular building, is an attempt to rethink the structural infill paradigm. The structural infill paradigm, Hertzberger, Habrack, and many of these people proposed that buildings should not be thought of as pure objects, but, and this is a competition entry by John Habraken for the Town Hall of Amsterdam, but rather as structures that are self-similar to the structure of the city. Here you see these kind of concrete slabs. And whatever is inside those slabs, in principle, is open. I mean, it could be anything. It could be a shop, it could be a wedding ceremony, it could be a bureaucrat, whatever you want. Habraken goes further in his theorization to argue that, these structures are structures that you find in the city that you can basically, of which are dimensions, patterns, grains that are recurring that can be used. This is the plan of this Amsterdam facility. There was actually no interior defined. It was just an open structure to be filled in. Now, while this is a great idea, I mean, it's really structured a lot of people in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and 80s. We've also seen the results in a number of these buildings and also the ways in which it went wrong. And one of the ways in which it went terribly wrong was detailing. And sort of, but with detailing, I mean a broader problem. The assumption that there would be an operational budget to change the interior from time to time and to rethink what would happen between those slats and to have a sort of really an organic living in that structure. Now there was no money to sustain that kind of organic living, so what you got was a pretty shitty detailed thing the first time around, and that then stayed in place for like the next 30 years. leading to buildings that were frankly not satisfying. One of the ideologies that also played a big role, especially with Habraken, was that the outside was not supposed to look like a building or like a strongly formed object with its own consciousness. Rather the opposite. The outside was to blend and become fabric with the rest of the city. So although there's a structural infill distinction, when it comes to the semantics and the architectural identity and presence and self-consciousness of the building, what we have is absence. The building, the structure, which is the permanent feature, hides into the interior, and some kind of temporary infill, self-expression of the users, whatever, defines the perimeter. This is what we propose to change. So, I mean, there are a number of attempts within structural infill that actually gave attention to the facade and said, let's do structural infill, but let's put the structure in the facade and make it a very permanent defining feature, keep all that infill and all that openness and flexibility, but not in the facade. So rather than an ideology of self-expression, in the elevation you go to an ideology of fixed civic form. And that's the one we've been going with. Here you see the project by Sterling. And this is the project that we're now building in Brussels, the first one. It's basically one of those 70 by 100 meter buildings that I showed you in the master plan, but it's been opened up, it's been diverted to have this kind of vortex effect. Luke will explain some basic principles of this building. This is the building that is also in building permit, and we hope to build it by May, June, something like that. Okay. Of course, inspirations that I didn't mention, but that are outside of the Hertzberger Habraken realm are Louis Kahn, clearly. The idea of structure. What is important here is that what Kahn does is also basically turn structure into a surface. So rather than having a beam and a column, which is what the big box does, he actually tries to surface it. So you get a big panel in which you cut a hole. It totally changes the representation and the dynamics of the building. And this is something we took a cue from in trying to transform the Hertzberger problem to current times. All right, so look.
Okay, thank you. As Alexander was saying, we had the ambition, and the client also has the ambition, that next to the monument, we try to see these urban warehouses, we try to see them also as new monuments. And how are we going to produce new monumentality? And so that was an idea of okay, the search, what is in fact the permanent layer of a building? Because if you say, okay, you want to create a monument, it has some permanency. And so if you look to the building, which is these different layers, it's like the permanent layer, let's say the infill, which is certainly not permanent. But the structure is certainly the permanent layer of a building, and that's what we try to do we did some iterations of how could this structure work and how could this structure give really expression to the building. So that the architectural identity and presence of the building could be shown in the permanent layer. And then we came with the Platonic panel, we call it. It's a panel. We searched a little bit we searched on the dimensions of the panel, how they structural could work, and we searched to the dimensions of the panel. It's a panel of 8.5 by 8.5 by 8.5 height, so it gives us a cubic form. And those rooms, they can receive 2 or 3 stories depending on what activity is. These inner stories, they in our opinion, are not a permanent layer. But those rooms, they can receive any program. In fact, they could become a parking spot. So if you would try to figure parkings in, it can work very well on that dimension. It could receive housing. It could receive gardens and even streets and shops. And this structure is not like an endless going on system, because when you stop it, when you end the system, it gives a formal definition, and so the system becomes really a formal object. and by making the clear distinctions, the facades. This was an installation with serious mock-ups at a third of the scale, so you could walk through it. And this is an installation that was made at the MIT, and we called it the Hommage to Habraken. What is also part of this exercise that the platform made there was, okay, Habraken said that the expression of the communities and constituencies that populate the project, they make the facades. Well, here it is in fact, okay, we can do that with ornament on the structures, and so the ornament is printed on the structure, but the structure by itself gives its formal identity. Here you can see the omnipotentials of this structural thing. Yeah? You can imagine anything happen in these structures. So we have in fact a street. You can here see the truck. So you can have streets, you can have shops, you can have gardens. There is practically everything is possible. Of course, you need to think that it could be open or it could be closed, and that is of course the thing that we that you have to manage with daylight and so on. And what is this iteration? What Alexander was talking about? That is, of course, the principle that we started with was we create a copy of the monument, which was 100 by 100 meters, and we opened it, and then we rotated a leg, and this is all to meet, in fact, the existing urban fabric. Then also there are some existing buildings that we needed to integrate, and that of course that are iterations that we need to take into consideration. We stack also some other stories on it, also to meet the urban regulation. And here you can see the project, in fact, without let's say the roof. On the right hand you see the monument, the 19th century monument. On the left side you can see the urban fabric, and in the middle is the project. In the first stage it will be a market building, but of course this program can evolve. So you can imagine having other functions, other public functions, but we also made the exercise to integrate parkings into it, to integrate housing into it, as you can see with the openness of the structure there. So these iterations are made on these structures. Here's an image of this new entrance to the market.
Now, for the third and the last strand of our conversation, the one that is in a sense the most trite, the megastructure. I just wanted to present to you a project that is a large-scale study we did for the coastline between the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. It's a kind of a realistic study. We did it with with engineers, hydrologists, like people with a realistic sense of expertise in this field. I'll mention them when I get there. But the big problem is that this was a design on a scale of 68 kilometers. So it's extremely long. I mean, the curvature of the Earth is very active at that scale. So to think simply in terms of objectified infrastructures becomes a little bit, well, not ridiculous, but complex, or not easy. So we went back also to infrastructural, again, to megastructural thinking, and see what kind of mistakes were made or what kind of approaches existed that could be relevant. One of them is in the work of Ludovico Quaroni, who is a progressive modernist Italian architect of the post-war period. And I will just show a few projects to you of his, chronologically of his work, in order to illustrate a relation between building, infrastructure, and landscape in his project, and how that relation became ever more contrived, became ever more rigid. inflexible, as going so far as making them all identically the same. This being a critical error that then ended up with the dissolution of the project of the megastructure altogether. But that was not the case yet in the early project. This La Martella project, which we thought was quite interesting, where you can see there is definitely a relation between the aggregation of built stuff, between the roads, and even between the vegetation schemes. And there are various formal relations being explored, but it's not a one-on-one. The scale of the building and of the plots of the building is not the same as the scale of the road yet. So there are definitely abstract, modernist, large-scale desires at work here, but also very muted, very, in a sense, mature, although it was junior work. But as you go through further work, so that was in the early 50s, now early 60s, you see this is a project for a coastal resort. You see how things become more and more identical, like just a huge circular building that is just one megaform with a road around it in exactly the same proportion, with a water body sculpted around it with, again, exactly the same formal apparatus. So the sort of identification of all the different tools in our instrumentarium to one geometrical recipe. And in a sense, this is too bad. I mean, not that this is of course not a bad project, it's an amazing project. But there is a sort of gradual impoverishment that is occurring. And the last project, which is also amazing, is for Rome in 1967, which he did together with Bruno Zevi, where you can see the infrastructures, the built material, the built stuff, the programs, all merging into one overall rigid composition. On the one hand, I think this is a powerful project, also really crazy, but it's extremely internally, put together in such a way that there is no more options left. Now, the scale of construction of this kind of big feat of man is such that you need to build time into the procedure of the form almost. It's otherwise hard to realize, and that didn't happen. But strangely, something funny does happen in pictures like this one, where what here still seems like really a script for a B movie, some kind of Star Trek, scenography. All of a sudden, if you squint your eyes, it starts to hold the middle ground between a Star Trek scenario scenography on the one hand, and a Piranesi drawing on the other hand. In this drawing, again, the forms start to break up into separate pieces, each with their own internal constitution, each relatively close to each other, but also seemingly at least somehow independent of each other. So maybe it's just a play of shadows, but somehow this picture of the model for us was much more convincing than that one, because somehow the glue between the elements has disappeared. So the project for the coast, we'll take up some of these issues and try to find a residual place for architecture, a very ambitious scale of architecture, but nevertheless one that finds its place in an overall scale of megastructural thinking. This is a picture, typical picture. Belgian coastline, could be northern France, southern Holland, doesn't matter, it's all like that. And this is the territorial waters of, well, in particular, the Belgian coast. So by the way, this was a funded study. Arcadis, IMDC, and AT&M were consulting firms that provided engineering expertise, and we acted as the designers. As you can see, it's an incredibly intensely, industrially exploited piece of water. There's many channels, there's many dredging, shipping, depositing of minerals and soil. There's contaminated ground, there's many pipes. And that big purple thing you see up there is a whole planned series of windmills, about 15 kilometers out. So this is just as a matter of scale. This is 50 kilometers. This is about 60 kilometers overall, from border to border. Now, many issues are facing the Belgian coast. One of them is overdevelopment. These are just nightmare shots of what might happen if nothing occurs. There's an enormous development pressure. It's an area with an interesting cultural heritage. Many surrealist and modernist artists lived and stayed at the coast and produced their main oeuvre there. This is James Ensor, with many drawings and pictures of coastal life and the absurdity of it, coastal tourism in the 19th century. Léon Spiliart, a painting that I just really love because I'm thinking back about the big boxes, the extreme horizontality, that actually is here part of the topography. A huge task for blue energy in the future. And so this is a sketch of a likely scenario. What you see here is the territorial waters. What is even more important in the distinctions of blue is you see a system of sandbanks, which have a very clear morphological, formal structure. It goes like this, all the way out until basically into the middle of the channel. It's a formal structure that we can use. We should take advantage of, and we did. And in a sense, well, to contextualize this discussion, if you think about the Palm in Dubai as really a megastructure, as a system where infrastructure, buildings, and landscape forms have been aligned exactly in exactly that way that we learned was rigid and ultimately dysfunctional in the later work of Quaroni, then this is the opposite. I mean, this is the anti-Dubai. There are very clear formal principles at work, but they overlap and they make choices. For instance, a linear morphology of banks that gradually will grow and will be heightened to become strips of land at low tide and just an archipelago at high tide. In a sense, this is nothing new. The historical structure of the coast was never as cleanly linear as it is today. It used to be. I mean, you can see, excuse me, many islands, flats, I mean, those are little at low tide, with little settlements on them, medieval settlements, whether it's monasteries or small fishing villages. This is the structure of the land in Roman time. This is the current coastline. And actually, as you can see, the coastline, the current coastline is retreated from the one that people estimated was in Roman times. So this project, on the one hand, creates form by gradually accumulating sand dredged out from the harbor in selected sandbanks that over time then become land. But this land, frankly, is very flexible. It's shifting land. It's land that can, it's part of a natural ecosystem. It's not architecture, it's landscape. And this is where our conversation again becomes important. That's the kind of land you get. It's very dynamic. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not particularly architectural. Where is there any task for architecture left in this kind of scale of formations? And we think that there is. And so we've developed a system of drums, big concrete drums of, let's say, a diameter of about 300 meter diameter, which is the equivalent scale of a village, an historical village. But it's built with a technique of oil rigs. Right? And so like an oil rig, you sink it. This sand is very dynamic, shifting, changing. But what the oil rig that you sink in, that's a permanent structure. Inside of that, you can develop. And for reasons that have to do with gravity, dynamicness of the land, and just erosion, it's actually impossible to have sprawl here. Well, you can't develop here. It's just not possible. So we can make a national park North Sea that is 99% natural, and that here and there has these punctured interventions, these villages, that allow you to actually see that national park. Finally, one very important aspect of this project is that there's a primary function of this project, which is national defense. Once in 5,000 year storm hits the coast, with sea level rises, currently that part of Belgium behind the coastline is very flat and lower than sea level, so it will be an economic and human tragedy. So we need a defense belt. And just like the Dutch are doing, this defense belt is more soft in nature. There were many conversations with the Delta Commission, or the Delta Works in Holland. And in this project, ultimately, the softness is the savior, but also it's a destructive protection of the mainland. What I mean, when the big storm hits, the island gets destroyed, but the mainland is saved. So the big storm hits, and nature withers. But you know what? Architecture stays. And so even as gradually, with ever rising sea levels, this land becomes more and more tenuous, and suffers from pounding after pounding, the drums will actually maintain. Nature may change forever, but architecture can be permanent. So we developed on one of these islands in more detail And so this is one part of the story. Now, how should any kinds of these settlements be located? Is there a way to operationalize a kind of, you know, miniature settlement program across a fake coastline? Yes, there is, and it's with a central place theory, a geographical analysis tool developed for the first half of the 20th century by German geographers such as Christaller and Lurch, drawings like this. The central argument, this is a mapping of southern Germany. The central argument that they made is that there is a formal relation in the distancing of these are all towns. Smaller circles are smaller towns, bigger circles are bigger towns. And they argue there's a formal geometrical relation between the different towns of different scales. This relation is on a triangle that are separated by circles and hexagons. There's a whole, I mean, it's a whole science in and of itself called central place theory. Probably some of you know it. Now, given the fact that this model, this geometrically pure model, can be detected in almost any proto-capitalist society as these distances of the towns, many cases medieval towns, is based on the travel distance to markets. So it's basically a proto-capitalist, market-oriented way of understanding settlement, which is basically consistent with the origination of many of these settlements. It also explains, not just in southern Germany, but also in Korea, in many, many countries around the world. It explains the formation of villages, again, in proto-capitalist societies, also in Flanders. So this is the Belgian coastline, and we rotate it, so if you flip it back, but then you do sort of a mapping, sort of crystal Lurch drawing of the very small villages on this scale, and then simply try to extrapolate the pattern, the triangulation system, so operationalize central planning theory, central place theory, on the other side, in the water, and from that derive the potential locations of these villages or drums. By the way, I mean, so we have 3 scales covered here. This is also really critical in the work. So there is a scale. At each scale requires its own intelligence level. You cannot just operate across the scale with one tool. But there is a big form, the morphology of the sandbanks. Another part is from the triangulation system that it sends. And then it articulates itself on the level of a single island pretty clearly, and then finally within the drum, a whole another level of architectural investigation is opened up. So the level of the coastline as a whole, the individual island with the drums. You see 2 drums on that one, and the architecture of a single drum. Okay, these are examples of the 3 strands. We've almost, I mean, I don't know if you're out of time. We have one more project, just a short one about objectification. Is that okay? Okay.
Okay, thank you. This is also a nearby town in Brussels. It's a very interesting town, as you have a medieval city center. And here you see a huge form, which is a huge formal design of the early 20th century, which is a royal park with a
19th century.
19th century, yes, royal park with a huge museum. It's a palace, a royal palace. And here you see the big avenue that is connecting this town with Brussels. It was one of those large works, urbanistic works, to put Brussels on the world scale at that time, on the world map. The thing is that, in fact, there is a problematic situation which, with the connection between the form of the park, the larger scale of the park, and the medieval scale of the town center, because yes, during the 20th century, then this became in fact an overflow of functions like a parking spot and like they put some football fields there. There were some communal ateliers put in that area. But they had, of course, the potential to be a very strong element, a connecting element, because that was exactly also the purpose of the study that we've done. It's in fact it was a competition that we have won. With one building, in fact, this building, which was an army building, army barracks, which has a great perspective give to all this water, to all these landscapes into the park. As a strategy to rethink this area, we found a double wing figure which integrates this element of how to connect, make these connections not only between the park and the town, but, and that is not so clear, you have the biggest forest of Brussels region which lays here, and this is a natural connection between the forest and the park. And so you can see that the figure is really the connector between everything which is happening in this town, which is called Tervuren. The competition was in fact about the north wing. So the double wing here, you see this army barracks. And you had already a formal structure that was the ancient royal botanical gardens. They were, in fact, sometime in the history, they were organized as a French garden. You can see it, French garden with parceling and the corridors in between. And this was already a figure that has this certain autonomy, which is very interesting that the site is still called Botanical Garden. So the name remained, but as they put it there, those overflow function, there was nothing left of it. The only thing that was left was a surrounding wall, which was already a surrounding wall around the botanical garden that needs to be kept, that it was protected. Here you can see this figure from which a large part is this wall, the existing wall that was an element that needs to be kept. And the main strategy was how can we make this zone very transparent, and how can we rely all these elements together. Here you can see the look over the project that we proposed. Here you can see this army barracks. On the lower side you see the park, and there you see the plaza of the medieval center with the church. In fact, there was three parts of it. They wanted to realize a lot of public program, which was here a new cultural center. Here you have the new town hall. And here is a third, which is a museum they want to add. So it is a lot of public program they want to add there. And this a new connection. There is a big high difference that you need to make there, but they really wanted a very good connection between the plaza and the park. And then you had also a recreational garden that was one of the program on which building were not allowed. And here you see the overview of the park. You can see the historical wall that goes around the botanical garden. And we add, in fact, this wing figure as a strategy to organize the whole zone, including the southern wing. Here you see the historical plaza, which needs to connect with this new esplanade to the park. And here you have the slight openings into the existing wall. And then the recreational zone that you can find there. We suggested a strategy, and this is in fact the formal strategy that we applied on this recreational garden, as these T-shaped walls elements that divide some public rooms into these recreational gardens. It is in fact a rethinking of the botanical garden, in which you had rooms that were separated by corridors. Here we inverse it. We make this separation by formal walls. So this is the infrastructure of the garden. And by which you can force people not to walk in the corridors overlooking the rooms. No, the people need to be part of the rooms. So by making these elements, people will not walk into corridors, they will walk into the rooms themselves. They have all each their own landscape design and own function. And this is this T-shaped object wall. And in the knuckle, we foresee openings so that you can walk from one room till another room. They have also different heights. It has to do also with the topography of the site, which is which is sloped. And here you can see the separation of this recreational garden. Then the plaza itself, we tried also to make it a very sober element by which we want to connect the plaza, the ancient plaza, with the park. We use therefore a stramp element, as you can see here, with a slope of 5%, and near the buildings it goes over in a real staircase, but this continuity of the public space. And here you can see the square itself, the new esplanade, where we also repeated those T-shaped elements. As you can see, in banks are used like that. The draining system will be like that, and also the light fixtures will be these T elements. Okay, thank you.
So, thank you. Yeah.
I think we have maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes to take some questions from the floor. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for the lecture, for sharing with us your experience. It is really refreshing to see some architectural strategies of dealing with bigness and not programmatic ones that we used to. It seems to me that in your examples, you are basically showing how we can deal with bigness as a single entity, as an object. But you don't really show an example of pattern generating a healthy urban fabric out of looking at a few, how you group them, those big forms, into sustainable fabric. What is your view? Going back to the peripheral environments where we need to generate some kind of logic for bigger systems, I would say. Do you believe in potentials of those fabrics?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, of course. I mean, I think that on the one, I mean, there's two answers to your question. On the one hand, yes, of course. And I think that with the work that we did in the European context, also once you actually get the project down on the ground that is real, we go to great lengths to make sure that things fit, that a building is actually not an obscene middle finger to its surroundings, but that it actually, without any kind of compromise about its own internal constitution, nevertheless is positioned and in a way that really interacts and is not a blind. Maybe grow, but also maybe respect is also not growing. I mean, by saying limited in the intervention, I mean, it's big, but we also don't want to keep growing. So if you keep it also finite, there's also a form of respect, perhaps. So we consciously steered away from really trying to make fabrics ourselves as in potentially ever-growing systems, and instead try to endorse the world and our environment by stopping ourselves at the right time. That's one our answer. The other answer is that in more in the United States context, what kind of fabric are we talking about? I mean, if you look at the fabric of strip malls along highways, or if you look at the fabric of subdivisions of 500 or 1,000 residences that are relatively similar, there is definitely a social fabric happening. There are people living there that have friends, and there's a fabric. But whether the architectural nature of that fabric is something that needs to be desperately respected is another question altogether. I mean, I think it's a different condition one finds oneself in there. But even there, I mean, I think we've always tried to, also for the American projects, define areas of intervention that by definition, not a fabric. So that I mean, okay, so you take the brown field or the empty space or the leftover area between two fabrics, it doesn't belong anywhere. Well, that's where a big ambitious project can happen. Because also, I mean, okay, so that first slide about the liberal monument, there's an ideology associated which is believing in the separation of public and private. So I mean, the realm of a fabric is the realm of the private sphere, I mean, of individuals' interests and expressions, etc. The public realm, where the collective gesture is being articulated, should not take away from those freedoms of the fabric. So we actually try to keep them apart out of respect.
Yeah, maybe before the next question, I have a few, Alexander. Maybe the first one that seems to became more apparent as you presented is that I think this whole notion of the infrastructure and what you seem to term as infrastructure at the end of the day seems less to do with, say, mobility lines, as you say, the systems, but more in terms of how large structures have the potential in a way to organize certain programs or certain way of life. And in which, when you started, you said one of the main ambition is to look at infrastructure, not a system, but to, in a way, as you say, objectify it to the point in which it becomes an artifact and a work of art. And of course, I was struck by that, and I was thinking, if it is a work of art, and if you know in terms of artifacts, artifacts have very strong quality to it, a very individual and strong quality. So I'm just curious, in terms of your project, what are the most specific ideas or influences that is driving this quality of the artifact? Because I see a very eclectic treatment of that structure that gives rise to certain potential. At one point, it's the rethinking of Kahn's flat structural facade, but with ornaments, for instance. And at some points, we see the use of a grid, for instance, in some projects. So to me, that quality that you seem to find as your goal, I suppose, to make infrastructure or the objectification of infrastructure, as you say, into a work of art, that to me is not very clear. So what governs, what drives, or what rules over these decisions?
Yeah. Well, one, I mean, if you talk about this, the fabric or the patterns that were applied on those panels, that was a side road in any case. It doesn't have anything to do with anything else in particular. This was, you know, this is part of there was something separate. Okay. But nevertheless, one of the things that we find really appealing about infrastructure, even in the way it's being produced today, is its anonymity. So that, you know, the technocratic quality of infrastructure being designed by engineers and policy planners, say, okay, we don't like that, right? No, we certainly don't. But at the same time, there is something about infrastructure which has there's the lack of consciousness of these forms provides them with a certain anonymity that we like to work with. And so in a degree, this appears in the buildings. I mean, at least I hope so. So that the beauty of an anonymous, of a non-signature, non-authored piece. Of course, you have to work very hard as an author to get there. But the beauty of a piece that has no clear signature. I mean, what I find interesting about infrastructure ultimately is that there is an apparatus of forms and semantics that lacks a signature. In a roadway design, in barriers, jersey barriers, in the most banal things, really. Fences, which we use also a lot. And just to work with those elements that are ultra banal and somehow, try to give them a form of consciousness. That's the way in which I think there is an objectification effort going on. I also have to admit to you that we are into this project. We're into this for a year and a half now. And between the stated ambition that we have on a theoretical level, which is the objectivate, infrastructural work for the American suburb, which is where this is really for, and our actual opportunities for design, which are more in European context at this point, there is also a disjunction there. So, but nevertheless, we try to make our European building projects that are about a sort of infrastructural / formal approach to the building.
Well, first of all, apologies for arriving late, but maybe my question was already answered at the beginning of the lecture. I mean, in your projects, which I really admire and was really happy to see things that I've never seen before, there is almost heroic belief, and you actually made that point clear also in the last answer, of the clear distinction between public space and private space. And of course, I don't want to rehearse kind of jingles of postmodern culture, but it's also true that that kind of difference today, not only actually formally, but juridically, for example, politically, is very difficult to make. And we could say that today there is nothing that makes more happy private interest than public space. If you talk to a developer, he wants to have public space because that would, in a way, raise the value of his property and his interest. And in fact, you referred to a moment which I think has been great for, and still actually remains the armature of many cities, which is the moment in which the state was able to dictate to private interest a framework. But we know that now we are on the opposite of that moment. We are in a moment where, in fact, private interest is ruling everything. And this crisis, instead of actually triggering the, let's say, resurrection of a strong role for the state, is actually seems to push for even more power on, let's say, private and corporate interests. So I'm really wondering what kind of, I mean, maybe my question is too big, but what kind of political projects this strong belief in the publicness of your projects and this difference between public and private can rely on? Beyond actually, of course, both the crisis of neoliberalism, but at the same time also the impossibility for the state or any kind of similar entity to resurrect itself.
Yes. Well,
Sorry.
I hear you completely, and I wonder in how far there is not a romantic misreading of a moment, maybe 40 years ago, when the welfare state effectively would have had that kind of power that you now attribute to it. I mean, if we take, I mean, you're completely schizophrenic between Europe and America at this point, so let's take both conditions. In the United States situation, definitely there was a welfare state component that was more present before the Reagan breakdown began in the 60s and 70s, the Great Society. Okay, fine. But if you look at the actual planning processes in towns and cities at that moment, and you look at them today, they're actually, and you look at them then as being formally done within the confines of the welfare state and the public government, and you look at them today as being done as public-private developments or as projects that are even completely produced by the private sector, what is most striking is the incredible similarity of both processes. So, I mean, I would actually dispute with you that ideal moment of welfare state existence as one that was truly benevolent. The one, I mean, I can speak to the American condition, it was always basically, a term used as governance, I mean, one where a series of major players, corporations, and big decision makers, together with a few families, would decide about the fate of a series of neighborhoods. It was then the case, that's today the case. Some things that have happened is there's much more embedding. I mean, there's more bribing to other constituencies that may revolt against the project that get something in return for them not revolting against the project. So there's a bit more of that happening, even though the private sector is now more in charge. But for instance, I mean, it's really interesting in Quincy, which is it's a town just south of Boston. The planning department has been abolished, and so the developer, there's a developer which has amassed a huge amount of capital, who's building all the roads. It's not even a PPS, it's just they're building all the roads and all the buildings, developing them, and then leasing the roads back to the city. It's a complete reversal. But strikingly, the model of development, what is actually being built, is not substantially different from anywhere else. So, whatever the shell, the underlying mechanism doesn't change all that substantially. That's for the US. Then for Europe, I mean, with so you know the Belgian situation a little bit, the rise of a building meister or a bouwmeester has really dramatically increased the one process that has changed that kind of old school governance system, that has changed the power play for architecture and also for community processes, etc., to be more involved. So, I mean, that experience, although yes, of course, now that's also going to be in retreat. I haven't seen for the last 34 years in that part of Europe at least a retreat. Definitely in America.